Okay, so today we're going to be learning about human trafficking from Dr. Javonda Williams-Moss. She is a UT professor in the College of Social Work and an associate dean of academic affairs. She's really passionate about human trafficking and has planned some really engaging case studies and important information to share with us, especially just around the opportunities that community and maternal support organizations have in recognizing and supporting human trafficking survivors and how we can all play a part in that. So please feel free to interact with her. I don't know, Dr. Williams-Moss, if you prefer chat box or people to unmute themselves, but you can kind of talk about that and I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Javonda, as Brooke said, and since it's such a small group, I am fine with you just unmuting and just talking and having a conversation as questions come up. There are some opportunities within the presentation for us to kind of delve into the material a little bit. So we will go ahead and get started. I have prepared a presentation, and so I just need to make sure that are you all able to actually see a presentation? Oh my gosh. Okay. So step one, that's like first thing that I've actually gotten right today. It has been a very Monday, Friday. So I'm very, very excited about this one thing that I at least was able to share the screen. So I want to start the presentation with just a little bit about myself. And so I kind of have this biography, slide, but what I will say is that I am a social worker. That is what I am by passion, by trade, by birth, by calling. That is, if I could go to school all over again, I would go back and study social work, which is probably why I ended up in academics, because I am in social work school every day. That's actually what I do for a living. But I started out my career working in child welfare, and I never essentially left. Sometimes you will hear me when I'm referring to child welfare, you will all hear me slip up and say we, because I still very much consider myself a child welfare social worker. So that's really where I got started in human trafficking. I did not start out my work in intentionally going into, I'm going to study and research and practice with survivors of human trafficking. I was a foster care worker. I worked foster care for a really long time and I loved it. But on my caseload, what I always remembered was that I always had children that would run away. And we would eventually, most of the times, find them. And I was practicing, I got my degrees from Florida State, so I spent a lot of time in Tallahassee, Florida. And if any of you know anything about Florida, then you'll understand kind of the problem that I had was that a lot of times when we would find my girls mostly that would be runaways, they would end up in Orlando or in Miami. And if anyone knows anything about Florida, that's a really long way away. And one of the things that I always was so confused about was like, how are they getting to Orlando? How in the world are they getting to Miami? I was, of course, a social worker with my big $27,000 salary. So that was actually a very big deal back then in the dark ages, but I was really proud of that salary, but I could barely afford to get to Orlando and Miami. And I'm like, how are you getting to these places? And they would always say, oh, my boyfriend said that we could go down to these places and you could stay with friends, or I could stay with his aunt, stay with his grandma. And come to find out, boyfriend was significantly older. And I just was confused, like, why is his mother okay with this, 13-year-old, 12-year-old, 14-year-old staying with him in this house, in this city that you're not from, with no adult supervision. And we just didn't know enough to put the pieces together. And as I began to learn more about human trafficking, then I figured out that very early in my career, where I would have said, I have no survivors and no victims of human trafficking in my caseload. As I learned more about human trafficking, I realized that most of my caseload was victims and survivors of human trafficking. And so as I talk with social service providers, which is now a big part of my research, I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's really where I come with this lens of being able to help you better identify trafficking victims that you're already seeing. you're already providing services to trafficking victims. And so we're going to look at ways that I can provide information to better support you in that role of providing services to trafficking victims. So I'm a Florida girl, born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. So no, I was not okay with the snow. It was very scary. I do not like snow. It was very, very, very scary for me. And so I am recovering. I am in recovery of this whole winter thing that you all do here. It's very weird. And so I did get all my degrees from Florida State University. And then after I finished college, I got a job in Alabama. And subsequently, I ended up at the University of Alabama for about 13, 14 years. But I seen the light finally and was able to have opportunity to come here to Tennessee almost 3 years ago. And I've been very happy and been here at the University of Tennessee ever since. As I alluded to, my background is with sexually abused adolescents and survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking. And that really came from my work in foster care and wanting to better care for children and youth that were in the foster care system, and then came out that area of expertise. So most of my research is going to be involving one of those criteria in terms of families, child welfare, trauma, and then of course, what I always tease about is that the children on my caseload grew up to be adults. And so then I've started working a lot with adult survivors as well. But you will see with a lot of the trafficking cases that you see and that we work with, that the victimization often starts in childhood and adolescence. So that's a little bit about me. My career highlights: I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. As I mentioned, I love the study in the profession of social work. And so working in academic affairs and working with education and educational systems is a really big deal for me. And I love every day at work. It really is amazing work that I do. So that's kind of a little bit about me. And so the agenda, what I would like to do today is really take some time to think about human trafficking awareness among maternal and prenatal support services providers in Tennessee. So really looking at human trafficking from this specific lens. Like I said, this is not the idea of what happens if you serve survivors of human trafficking. The idea of this training is that you already are. And so we're going to talk about support services and what does that really look like in Tennessee. And we're going to talk through all of those ideas, but really this is already happening. You're already seeing them. As I talk, you're going to start seeing clients in your head. And when you do, I want you kind of to take note of some of the flags and some of the things, but I will start describing your clients without their names during this presentation, because it is just that common. That's really what we're doing. So we're going to talk about definitions of sex and labor trafficking. We're going to look at some of the stats here in Tennessee, talk about some of the signs that you may see in some of your agencies, and really begin to think about the symptomology. In other words, how the experience of trafficking is impacting the victims and survivors that you're serving. So what does that look like in terms of the symptoms? And then I would like to have a conversation about resources and supports. Again, we're a small group today, so anytime you have questions, just stop me. Hey, Jay, what did that mean? Or you have specific things that you want me to go into more detail about, or if there's something I can provide clarification on, we can stop and talk. We don't necessarily have to use the chat function as much since we have a small group today. Is there anything else that's not listed on here that someone else you all would like to cover that's not in the agenda that if we have time, we can come back to? We can kind of start like a parking lot. Good. Okay, I'm checking the chat. Looks like no one's unmuted. All right, so let's roll. Okay. This is probably one of my favorite slides. I think I spend a lot when people find out my area of expertise. One of the things that I get well, Jay, I was in the store and there was this creepy guy following me in a white van. And is that what human trafficking looks like? And so I get this, always get these very outlandish stories about people's fear around human trafficking and what it really looks like. And so a lot of times we have this idea of this thing that's happening with these national, international espionage crime syndicates. And it looks like, the kidnapping of children, like in the movie Taken, which, by the way, I hate that movie for this very reason of that. That's typically not the way that this happens. That only women are trafficked, only, our international, like this is something that plagues our international, foreign national communities. And all of that is absolutely false. All of that is false. And so a lot of times, this kind of hinders what people are seeing when they see the way that trafficking victims really present. If people have this image in their head, then it doesn't help us in identifying survivors and victims of human trafficking. So you all are now in the cause with me of debunking these myths. That no, that is not actually what we're seeing in terms of what human trafficking really looks like. So if this isn't what's true, so let's talk about what really is true. Okay, this is what we really know. Anyone can be impacted by human trafficking. We have some indicators around communities that experience marginalized communities or communities that experience high levels of oppression. So people of color, immigrants, people who identify as LGBTQIA plus are disproportionately exploited. But we talk about economic disparity, housing insecurity, runaway foster care. So there's kind of how I started. People with histories of childhood or sexual abuse, people with mental illness, substance abuse, any kind of systemic oppression. It's like, oh my gosh, that could be anybody. Yes, 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 and yes. This is one of the things that if we can just really get people to understand. So now that you all are all in my cause, now that we're all working to help people understand this, is that the trafficking is not an accident. The traffickers target specific people. This is a business. One of the things that in my research and what we're learning is that for the traffickers, this will overtake, it probably already has in terms of really looking at some of the criminal justice statistics. Human trafficking will become more prevalent than drug trafficking. What the bad guys, the traffickers, have figured out is that if I sell you an illegal drug, you use that once, and now I have to go out and get more product for you to use. But I can sell a human over and over and over again. If I am caught with an illegal drug, then I go to jail. If I am caught with another person, then odds are if I can explain it away, then I do not go to jail. This is very, very lucrative for this group of people that have decided things that, we thought we said a long time ago, like we don't sell other humans. This is now the idea that this is profitable. It is really appealing to this group of people. So they have this figured out. So we want to sell people. How do we get away with this? Well, we need to be able to get people and we don't want them to escape. We don't want them to run away. We don't want to be caught. So we start thinking about who are people that we can get away with that. We need people that maybe need something. We need people that maybe that we can provide some sort of need, that we can kind of fill a need. Maybe they need somewhere to stay. Maybe they need some additional attention. Maybe they need housing. Maybe they need, so as you start thinking about that economic disparity, housing disparity, youth who run away, foster care, we think about poverty in general. That is a really, really good place for traffickers to start. Poverty, poor people, in terms of promising things for the person that they want to sell. And we'll get into that a little bit. And so when we think about the idea of the traffickers coming in and trying to pretend to meet a need, that's where all the disparities come from. People with a history of childhood sexual abuse. One of the things that we know in terms of the symptomology of that, of history of childhood sexual abuse, that there is oftentimes a lot of shame and guilt associated with childhood sexual abuse. And so traffickers prey on that to be able to, we'll talk about kind of coercing individuals into this illicit trafficking circle. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So we have mental illness, substance abuse, systemic oppression. So all of these factors that would disproportionately put someone at risk, that would make someone vulnerable, that's who they are targeting. That is why we will see, even in Tennessee, we have high numbers of child trafficking because children are vulnerable. And in this country, if you want to do something really, really mean, you do it to a child because you have a better chance of getting away with it. That's a whole nother conversation. But really, when we think about the risk factors, and I talk to a lot of parents who are scared, they are really, really scared about this as we start thinking about it. With some of the cases where I've had very, very young victims, the traffickers will often talk with girls that are maybe struggling with self-esteem for some reason, that are feeling outcast. Maybe girls that are really struggling with their home situation, and they start making promises. And so just in terms of thinking about that, to be very keenly aware that these are all risk factors and anyone can be impacted because it is an issue of vulnerability. And so that is one of the key takeaways. Any questions before I kind of go on to some definitions about that? And so we've dispelled the myth of the poor person riding around in that white van who has been accused of trafficking a lot because that it just looks creepy. But honestly, they are actually very, very organized, very skilled at what they do. And so they're not often going to be in the grocery store following you as you pick out the macaroni. That would get them caught. So they are much more sophisticated than that. Questions? Well, this is the standard definition for human trafficking. We talked about the exploitation of humans for the purposes of sexual and labor servitude, where something of value is exchanged. We talked about this: money, food, housing, drugs, through means of force, fraud, or coercion. We will get into some of the technicalities of these definitions, but I want to highlight that for minors under 18, force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be present if they're a minor. In a lot of states, we have we used to call them there's no such thing laws, essentially dispelling this idea, the myth of a teen prostitute. There is no such thing as a teen adolescent prostitute. That is human trafficking. And that's where that definition comes in. It's like, well, what if the 14-year-old wants to do it? Well, because a 14-year-old cannot consent to sex and they're a minor, it is trafficking. And so as we start to think about the implications of that, we start talking about those myths and what I've seen in my work, where there was this idea of, if the 14-year-old, so going back to my caseload, if they went away to Orlando with the trafficker, which they didn't call trafficker, they didn't call pimp, they called their boyfriend. We'll talk about that. If they willingly go, then somehow there is this idea that they are not a trafficking victim, they are a prostitute. That is what the trafficker tells them. And they say a lot of times, well, then if you call the police, then you broke the law too, because prostitution is illegal. So there is this idea of, we talk about that coercion and how that all gets twisted. And so if it's a minor, they're under the age of 18, we don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. If they are exploited where they are exchanging sex or labor with something of value, then it is trafficking. There is no such thing as a teenage, adolescent, underage prostitute. That doesn't exist. It's human trafficking, and that language wasn't around when I started practice. And so we are working on kind of the awareness of all of that. I'll pause there for any questions before we go on to some really important concepts about force, fraud, and fraud. How's everybody doing? Like, I realize that I talk about this stuff a lot, and it is kind of a part of my work, but it actually is very heavy. It can be incredibly heavy. So I guess I want to do a check-in right quick. How is everyone doing? Okay.
Doing fine. Like you said, it is a heavy topic, so
I'm a lot of fun at parties, right? What do you do for a living? It's like,
you
oh,
seem like you actually would be fun. You just have to cover a heavy topic at work, so
right. All
seem very
right.
positive overall,
Yeah.
which I'm sure is needed to cover this type of topic so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And but I do talk about it a lot. So at parties, it's like, okay, all right. So, all right, we will have it heavy but necessary. Got it. Got it.
Yeah, this is Denise, and I'm good. I've been doing child welfare for over 40 years, so I'm kind of with you. Started at foster care, and so I understand. Been doing this a long time, so it is heavy, but it's something we have to talk about, and we need to talk about more.
Denise, I mean, were you, in terms of doing this for a long time, like there were so many kids in our caseloads that we missed because we
Yes,
didn't
yes.
understand.
We didn't. Right, right. We didn't. Well, it's crazy because when you think about, we didn't even begin investigating sex abuse until the 80s. And when you say
Yeah,
that, people go, what? But it's true. We
it's
didn't,
true.
we didn't even talk about sex abuse until the 80s. And when you look back on that and you tell people that are young, they go, what? But we didn't. We didn't even investigate sex abuse until then. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely something that is we need to be talking about because human trafficking is an issue, and so many of the kids in foster care that are runaways, that's what happens to them. And you're absolutely right. So it's a tough subject, but we do need to talk about it more, even though it is uncomfortable.
Yeah, very much. I think some of the parts that really get me is that as I think about it, I'm thinking about the kids. It's like, that's what was going on.
Yes, yes,
That's what that was. But we absolutely just didn't have that knowledge.
we didn't.
Education and law enforcement, and yep. So yeah, all of it. We see all of it. So we see it in the schools. We see it if you
Yes,
are working with people, you have worked with victims and survivors of human trafficking. We talk a
absolutely.
little bit about kind of the reality of that, but it really is true. And so the more we can identify those signs, those red flags, I think the better job we'll be able to do with providing appropriate services.
Right. And
So
I'm
when we
and I'm,
think
and I'm
about, yeah, go ahead.
and I'm not sure that you may talk about this a little bit later. Most of the counties that I'm serving are rural counties, and I think people think, well, that doesn't go on in rural. I mean, that Memphis and Nashville and
Of
Knoxville, but
course,
but really and truly, it's much more prevalent than people think, and because it's more hidden, because people don't know and they're not aware, and there's not a lot of identification of what's actually going on. So
there isn't. One of the things that I think when you mentioned that, like with the last research project that we had, we became like, there was a few years ago, the big thing about Atlanta and Memphis and the human trafficking corridor or whatever they called it. And we were very, very thankful for that kind of awareness. But our rural counties were like, it's not going on. And this is like very basic for child welfare.
Yes.
For those of you in education, you all have seen this a million times. I cannot tell you how many people on my caseload where I had a parent that was addicted to drugs that sold their children for sex in exchange
sex.
for drugs.
Drugs, yeah.
That is human trafficking. And when I was talking to child welfare workers, they were like, Javonda, that's half my caseload.
Well, and now we're working with, with the prenatal families and moms that we work with. I think that's something that we're not, that unless you are alerted to it or you don't, and so I'm thankful for this. I'm thankful for this webinar. And I hate that there's not more focus on it, but again, because I think so many times people think, oh, well, that's not, that's for big cities. That's not going on in our community.
Yeah, we don't have that. Yes. And it's like, yeah, we do.
We do.
And because it seems so, it's almost so plain, and we're so used to it. The bulk of my cases were not kind of like we talked about the international espionage, guy in white van, person being kidnapped. It was family trafficking and then trafficked by romantic partners. That was the bulk of my caseload, where we called them Romeo. That's kind of the title that we give them, kind of the Romeo trafficker, where they will see usually it's a younger person, and it can be boys and girls. It can be boys and girls, and they start to promise them things. They tell them that they love them, and the child or the victim thinks that they're in a relationship with this person. They think that it's a romantic relationship. Usually they start out by giving them a lot of attention, and they shower them with a lot of gifts. And then something happens, and it's usually, oh, I lost my job, or I need your help. I need you to do me this favor. And that favor usually involves some sort of providing sexual acts, sexual favors to other people as a favor to your boyfriend. And if you really love me, you would do this, and now you owe me. And then at that point, they convince the victim, now you are a criminal. And so I will tell the police, or I will tell your parents, or I will tell your principal, I will tell your teacher, if you do not continue on. Oftentimes they use drugs. We talk about food, housing, money, and drugs to keep the victims in this cycle. And it happens over and over and over again. And so we see a lot of these acts within families. And like we talked about, Denise, rural communities have families. Rural communities have schools, rural communities. And so this is where it's happening, and this is what it looks like. So let's talk about.
I have a question real quick, I guess, if that's okay. For those that have been in this field a long time, like you mentioned, Javonda and Denise, how much growth in these types of situations happening have you seen, and what do you attribute the growth to, if there is? Like, do you contribute more of it to the laws and being more aware of it, or maybe to the growth of broken homes, or is it compounding within these factors? I was just curious.
Yeah, I think that we're better with detecting it. I think it was always there. And we'll kind of talk about some of the numbers in a minute, which is going to be good and bad. But so I do think that we're doing a better job at detecting what's going on. I also think that there are a lot of broken systems that we are responding to that have made it, quite frankly, as one of the traffickers, and I will tell you all solidly, I'm in victim services, so working and talking with traffickers is not my strong suit, but I've had some opportunity in some of the work that I've done that it has become quite easy. Honestly, there's a lot of access to vulnerable populations via social media, via internet. And so that has made it a lot easier. And then like we said, there are just a lot of broken systems that we're responding to where we're not providing enough support to vulnerable people. Does that kind of sadly answer your question?
Yeah, that provides some insight. I was just wondering, since I had people here that obviously have had lots of experience in it, in over a decade or two, so, or three.
I think too that, the increase in the basically the substance abuse in the families, there's so much more. Again, one of the things we're seeing in like in some of the rural areas we have, when a family member is, using drugs, or they are addicted to drugs, and family members trying to help them get out of it, they get pulled into it because of that. And so when it ends up in court, or there's an overdose, then it becomes, as law enforcement begins to investigate, then they find out what's really going on in the family. And so sometimes things have gone on for years and years, and they didn't know about it until there was, an overdose or substance abuse issue brought to court, and then the case begins to unravel, and things become more known at that point.
Yeah, the substance abuse drives a lot of these problems, and we see a little bit of that because it's also driving it, but it's also perpetuating it. As oftentimes within this cycle, it is not uncommon for traffickers to use drugs as a form of control of the victims. It is not uncommon at all. So we have that multiplicative of impact of, in addition to the trauma that the victims are experiencing with trafficking, then you also add these substance use issues that are often added. So it does compound the issues.
Thanks all to you for the insight.
I do want to take a few minutes to really think about and really help kind of explain force, fraud, and coercion, because when we think about trafficking in adults, this is these are the three conditions, one of the three conditions that have to be met. So this idea of using force, so physical abuse, assault, threat, confinement, literally forcing your will on someone. Fraud, I will give you this if you do that, and it being fraudulent, so those false promises, withholding promised wages or contract fraud, and then coercion, the threats of harm to self, to others. We're going to, send this to your family, and to your boss, and to your pastor, and to your, so that coercion, document confiscation, utilizing substances. That's where coercion comes into it. And so when we have human trafficking, and we're talking about for adults, one of these have to be present. So let's talk about the two types. So we have sex and labor. So the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And remember that does not have to include force, fraud, or coercion for minors. Again, no such thing as a child prostitute. One of the things that I've done is in another state that I worked in was when they did bus for prostitution, and the cops would set up rings. One of the things that I would talk to, I did the John's class, which was a very interesting experience for me, being on the side of victim services, but they really thought that it would be helpful for the Johns that were caught in the prostitution rings. And this is like a terrible way to think about this. If they took this class, then the charge would not show up on their record, like a traffic ticket. But one of the many issues we had with that is that there wasn't a corresponding course for, let's say, the victims that were arrested for prostitution. Like, was there a corresponding course that we could see whether or not they were actually trafficking victims, whether or not they were there on their own will? Well, one of the things that we would talk about was that they had no way of knowing whether or not if this person was an adult, which number one, they couldn't always verify, whether or not they were there on their own free will. And of course, all the Johns swore they could tell. And I said, well, I'm a professional and I work with lots of other professionals, and it's hard for us to tell. And so the idea of sex trafficking in the commercial sex industry, where we know that we have a good portion of individuals in the commercial sex industry that are indeed victims of human trafficking. We've had a lot of work on, I think, a lot of work in that area. And then what also goes undetected a lot that is we have a really big problem with is labor trafficking. We don't think about this a lot, but I always include this because this is also a serious issue. And this is using kind of the same definition, but it's for labor. And it's thinking about that forced fraud or coercion for the purposes of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And yeah, that we are still literally talking about slavery, which is unbelievable to so many of us, but that's essentially what is happening. And it's not just happening somewhere far away. It's happening to some of the people that you all are serving. And so what I would like to do is take a moment to do a case study. And I want you all to think about some of the criteria of forced fraud and coercion to see if you all can identify that, and then talk about the elements of the harboring, transporting, or provision or soliciting of the purpose for one of these acts. So let's go through our case study. And so the first one, as you read this, I want you all to think about forced fraud or coercion. And you all can either unmute yourself or go in the chat as you begin to think about elements of forced fraud or coercion that you see. This is a pretty typical case where the trafficker kind of uses a female relative to get the victim. Trafficker giving cocaine, continuing to supply the cocaine. And so as you read through this, if you want to use the chat, as you see elements of forced fraud or coercion, could you please put them in the chat and we'll talk about them. Okay, anybody want to get us started? You can either unmute yourself and start putting in the chat. Coercion, yep. The debt bondage and the using of the substances, absolutely.
I would also say fraud too, because he kind of like lured her in by using his niece, right? And so like using a friend to misrepresent, who you are.
Yep, exactly.
And then fraud as well because of the, I mean, she was never never able to pay off the debt
Right.
because she kept
That's what I was thinking too. That's what I thought you were going to say, Brooke.
Yep.
able to pay off the debt.
Exactly. And Jessica's calling out that force, abusing of the other women in front of our victim here. Yes, 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 yes. So you can kind of see how that all plays out. But this is a really good example of this. And so one of the things that we know about trafficking victims is that they actually do not identify as victims. A lot of times when we've been working in this field a while, we realize that a lot of the clients that we serve do not always say, oh, thank you so much for the wonderful services that you are providing to me in that moment. In that moment, that may not be the interaction that you have with a lot of clients. And what I find in my work, particularly with a lot of survivors of human trafficking, is that they do not see themselves as victims. Can anyone from this scenario identify why Cecilia would be hesitant to go to the police?
Well, I mean, her use of cocaine, obviously,
Well, yeah.
use of cocaine and the fact that, and also the fact too that,
Sex acts.
Yep. Yep.
And maybe just even fear that they can't ultimately protect her at first.
Right.
Fear of violence from the trafficker.
Yeah. So fear of violence, and then fear that I may actually get arrested. And yeah, all elements of all three. All the money that he loaned her, yeah, and now she owes him. Exactly. Yeah, all of these coercive tactics that we see. And then because a lot of times that's what people say, well, if they were really being trafficked against their will, why don't they just go to the police? Why don't they just go to the police? Well, you all just explained why Celia very reasonably would not go to the police. Can be very dangerous for them. And all of the other issues around to see that outburst of hitting and strangling other people. And then the issue of the drugs and also the issue of the commercial sex. And I would like to say that those fears are unfounded, but do we still incarcerate victims of human trafficking for things that they do while in victimization as a part of their trafficking experience? Do we still actually criminalize victims of human trafficking for these things? In many states, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Well, not only that, too, I was thinking shame. I mean, just overall feeling of shame can be heavy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's very real that she could end up in jail. Like, she could get busted for prostitution and end up in jail. That is real. So you avoid services. And this is kind of where, as you all are thinking about your interactions with the survivors and victims that you're serving, this is or one of the reasons why this can be incredibly challenging. A lot of the victims are not very forthcoming. Fear, shame, fear of the trafficker, fear of of law enforcement, fear of you all. Who will you tell? Will you call the cops? So anything else? Anyone else have any other insights before we talk some numbers? So I get asked this question a lot, so I thought I'd start with just some numbers and we can kind of talk through what some of this means. And then one of these slides, I actually have a question for you. Is there a lot of people from Tennessee on the call? I was hoping that we'd have a lot of people from the area, because there was something in this report that I absolutely didn't understand. I was like, oh, someone from Tennessee can help me with that. So, this is what it looks like. This is the number of calls, trafficking calls, tips. Chase, as you mentioned, we see like this increase, we see the awareness increasing. We see, you know, a lot of the broken systems that we talked about, substance abuse issues with what we're seeing in our families, where, you know, the gaps that we're seeing in our education system, all of these things where we see this study increase, and this is NPC. So our official number from last year, 1375. That's the official number that TBI has given us. Okay, this is does anyone know what U East would be? Like, I know East, I was like, what is U East? And of course I looked and I could not find that. I've heard of West.
Maybe Upper East.
Upper East.
See, I figured you all would know.
Yeah.
What areas is that considered?
That's like Johnson City, Bristol, Kingsport, Tri-Cities, you know, that kind of pocket.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And versus East in terms of Knoxville, Chattanooga. Okay.
Right.
Okay, thank you. See, I knew someone would be able to help me with this. Very interesting what's going on in U East versus East. Middle, which I learned is not central, but it is middle. And so I'm learning all my Tennessee terms. And then we've had some tips out of state, and then they kind of have this bucket for unknown. But all of these numbers, when we're talking about it, makes everyone a little uncomfortable. They're like, that's a lot of tips. These are just people calling in saying, hey, I think, you know, there's something going on here and it doesn't feel right. I want someone to kind of look into this. So it is incredibly concerning. And
Can I say something about those numbers too?
Yes.
If you look at middle, which, you know, would be, of course, that most of that's my area. You're going to see a lot of rural counties there, and also in Upper East, you're going to see a lot of rural areas. And I mean, not that there's rural areas in the West and also in the East, but I think the majority of very rural areas are going to be in the middle, lower middle, and also in Upper East. You're going to see a lot of areas.
Same, yeah. At least in terms of Upper East, and my understanding of that area is like a lot of rural area.
And I think that's the reason why you see so many numbers in both of those areas, is because of the rural nature of those.
Yeah, and so
West is really rural too. Like, I cover Decatur and Benton counties as health educator, and because of I-40 right there, we see a lot of it, believe it or not.
Oh, I believe it. Absolutely. And so it's kind of interesting where we're seeing the tips come in. And why do you all think we're seeing less calls coming in the East? That kind of struck me in terms of in looking at the state and what's going on. What's different about that East area?
I would think in larger scale that maybe rural areas are targeted just because they think it might be easier with less eyes, less density, population density.
And I also think too that because of those counties that you're looking at in the East, they're much more urban counties, and I think when you're talking about calls and tips, it's folks calling to find out maybe that have some suspicion,
right?
And I think that probably that's not to say that the human trafficking is not going on there, but I think that when they get a call about a tip or it's more about questions and could this possibly be going on, and I think folks maybe are much more savvy to it in the East, and I say also in the West, just because I think there's a lot more attention to it in those areas. And I could be wrong about that, but that's what I would think.
Yeah, and that's a good kind of, as we're thinking about law enforcement presence of social services and the overlap with the healthcare deserts. Yeah, and every other kind of desert, as we think about, remember going back to one of the first few slides when we talked about the systems of oppression and poverty and being poor and kind of having high need, how that overlaps with what you all are saying in terms of these people having these concerns, like, hey, this doesn't look right, and I want to kind of want someone to look more into this. So let's look at the actual cases. Well, first let's look at the types of trafficking. Labor, there is labor trafficking. Adult sex. Oh my, look at that minor sex trafficking. Look at that. Look at that. That is, once again, as we think about who is vulnerable, and then kind of a combination of both, and then other or this kind of like there's something going on there. But we didn't know quite where to put it. So they did have a nice category for that as well. But is anyone surprised by the types of trafficking that are actually being reported that we
I was gonna say, I'd be curious to see how the labor breakdown is since it seems to be all inclusive
Hmm,
in terms of age.
yeah. I
I know
think
more vulnerable in the minor categories. So
yeah, it
it's
is. Yeah,
surprising,
and that is
unfortunately.
you know, when we start thinking about that, we talked about the sobering idea that the idea of selling our children for sex is profitable, and we have a serious problem with that. Not overseas in Tennessee, like just kind of understanding. And yes, I think that there are definite issues with labor trafficking given some of the seasons that we can see some issues with that, definitely with seasons. And so depending upon what's happening, and also the idea of people not calling in labor trafficking as much, not understanding a lot of the signs of labor trafficking. So these are the cases then that that they worked on. So they talked about majors and assists and reports. So that just thinking about who kind of led the case, where TBI versus the actual local jurisdiction versus kind of calling in from out of state kind of reporting. You have this person that is, suspected of human trafficking and then working on those cases. So these are the actual cases. Notice a difference and a significant drop between the cases and the reports. And yes, it is harder to report because it's easier to get away with labor trafficking. So these are our numbers. And so we spent a few minutes talking about the numbers, and now I'm going to tell you that none of them are good. None of them are good. Anytime anybody shows you a human trafficking number, you can say that there is no reliable estimate for the number of trafficking victims in America. We don't know. We have some, we can think about calls and tips versus investigations, and those are all giving us an idea, but we do not know. We do not know. We do not know because it is so hard. Remember that the victims are not going into the police. We know how many robberies, because typically when someone is robbed, they call the police and they say, hello, someone has taken my stuff. Due to the fact that we are usually depending on those tips and arrests and reporting. And therefore, we really don't have reliable estimates. And that is one of the sobering cases. But we do have some ways of kind of thinking about it. And this is really important as you guys think about the numbers. So in a lot of studies, with populations of 2.3 million to 600,000, right? The human trafficking incidents identified by law enforcement and social service agency records likely represented only a fraction, right? Only a fraction of the actual people that, and thank you for kind of putting up that link around that. Most studies say that when you see that numbers, any of those numbers, that maybe between 14 and 18%, that number represents, all those numbers actually represents 14 to 18% of the victims. And the numbers can also be misleading because we count cases, but there could be 3 victims in one case. So we don't have good, reliable estimates. And so some of them look to say that because of the way we count them, jurisdictional, the way that victims report, maybe 6%. So, it's sobering to think of that, here we have this big problem and we really don't know how big it is. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Okay. All right. So are y'all seeing these slides again?
Yeah, now we are.
And so now let's specifically talk about trafficking survivors and maternal care, like what this really looks like specific to our area that we're talking about today. Because of the sexual trauma and victimization, trafficked women experience unplanned pregnancies, STIs, and a lot of research say at least one abortion. At least. All of those things would mean that at some point they are receiving some sort of care. And then this is the part, this is not like after, like they've been trafficked 2 years ago. Women are often receiving maternity care while being exploited. So some of the numbers say that as many as 87% in some of the research reported that they are in contact with you all. They're telling us, they are in contact because they're accessing care for these issues, whether it's an STI, an unplanned pregnancy, some trauma, getting some sort of social services, getting some sort of help while they are being trapped. So we have a tremendous opportunity to support survivors and maybe help them while they're actually in the situation. Very, very sobering to think about that. But because of the issues that we've talked about, the domestic violence, substance abuse, financial difficulties, all of those other things, they really do come to the attention of a lot of social service providers. So a lot of times we talk about being hidden in plain sight. That's what's happening. So the signs, abortion minded, coming in talking about abortions, the unplanned pregnancy, not knowing their home address, talking about just visiting the area, STIs that are untreated or reoccurrent, exhibiting anxiety, depression, fear, high number of sexual partners, lack of insurance, being far along in the pregnancy with no prenatal care. So showing up late second, third trimester, continued sign inappropriately dressed. So, and think about that in terms of the weather and what they have on. Tattoos, ask about the tattoos, become comfortable with asking about that tattoo. Lack of identification, undocumented immigrants, accompanied with someone who does not want to leave. You get that look that they both look at each other when you ask to see your client alone, and they get kind of nervous and, oh no, she needs me in here with her. Malnourished, poor hygiene, signs of physical abuse. Is anyone seeing some of their clients as I'm describing this list? Are their faces popping in your head? Yep. Yeah, they are. So when we think about this, this is the symptoms. This is then what comes out of that. Oftentimes they will have concerns, headaches, stomach pain, stomach aches, back pain, depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal attempts. So you will see all of these that are very common. So as you see those signs and then you see these complaints, if they start talking about these things along with those signs, it's time to start asking a few more questions. And we can talk about that. But I want to get to this case study. It's just going to take a second to kind of get through. But I really wanted to kind of talk about a maternity case that we ran into. This was the client BO was an immigrant to our country and was new to the community and was very, very gifted braider, so braiding hair. And this is a labor abuse, a labor trafficking case. So I'll give you all a few minutes. Someone give me kind of a thumbs up when you want me to change the slides. I think this goes on for a couple of slides, but I think it's well worth it for us to kind of take some time to kind of read through. You ready? Okay. Good. So let's talk about this. What questions would you want to ask? So now this is not the case study, this is your client. And the client that always shows up like 2 hours early for the appointment, like, why is he here this early? Oh my gosh. Malnourished, underweight. Had some complications and is now like, I don't want to go home, but can't give you a reason why. What are some questions you want to ask? And you're free to do chat or unmute yourself. And
I think it's tough even to know where to start sometimes, when we're working with these populations, because you don't want to ask something that you think might scare them away or make them think that you're going to tell on them. But you kind of have that inkling in the pit in your stomach that makes something is a little off. And so I don't know, that's hard. Like, where do you start? Of like, there's a fine line between recognizing them and letting them know that you're there and you see what they're struggling with, then like reporting them or getting them in trouble or making it worse for them at home. Like, that's difficult.
right. And so I love that. Like, why? But is that going to really help with opening them up, asking them general questions about the excitement, who are the support system? And this is where we get to, and then I have a tool. And then we're going to talk about some resources really quick. I know we are running on time, even though we've kind of hopefully had a chance to answer your questions as we go along. So this is a tool, and I will give you all this. And one of the things that we talk about is kind of because of the prevalence of trafficking, the idea of some sort of universal screening that should be there, particularly for your areas. Everybody gets screened for trafficking. Everybody gets screened for trafficking. So they talk about signs to look out for. And then once that's kind of, when you have that spidey sense, which I always talk about for a social service providers, yeah, we get the spidey sense. We get that knot in the stomach. We know something isn't right. What questions do we ask? Well, these are the questions. And these can be in forms of a conversation. They could be on the form that you give to everyone. You can kind of think about ways that you and your agency can work through how to get this information. But these are the questions, getting the patient alone with social worker or medical professional. These are the questions. Have you been ever forced to do work you didn't want to do? I wonder what BO's answer would be to that. Forced to have sex to pay off a debt. Has anyone held identity? Have your documents? Physical abuse. So these are specific, there's a specific reason why we ask those questions. So if yes, they talk about the National Resource Center. We do have some local resources on the next slide. If no, then we can kind of refer for some other services. The point is to really be able to think about asking those questions. I know a lot of times as a child welfare worker, having to learn how to ask about, sexual abuse. And did someone touch you inappropriately? And first it was like, ooh, I don't know whether or not I want to ask someone that. Or when we're doing suicide assessments and asking someone about suicidality, and we're like, ooh, I don't know if I can do that. And definitely being able to ask and have conversations and not being known as the question. So I like that, Melissa, to be able to talk about engaging while ensuring the client knows that nothing will be done that may engage the aggressor, which is we think about providing that safe place for our clients. And so as you talk about, Chase, yeah, being able to ask the question, maintaining confidentiality, all the things that y'all already know how to do because y'all already know how to do suicide assessments and homicide assessments and all those other things, domestic violence assessments, y'all already know how to start asking these questions. And so as you think about that, these are some questions. So we will have all of these tools for you all, but I do want to also share with you all some local resources. And that you all have. If there are more, please throw them in the chat so we all can, so I can add to my resources as I'm relatively new to the area and cannot wait to start working with all of you all. There is one project that I want to take some time to share with you all with some of the work that I did with my last on my last grant that I had, my last federal grant. Where we were looking at human trafficking, primarily sex and labor trafficking. And we really wanted to think about ways that we could have a resource for community members, maybe that aren't social workers, but they are talking to people, they are talking to y'all's clients, and what can we do to prepare people? The friendly chat, as you're talking about, Denise. And as you're having that friendly chat, you can be gathering information. And so one of the things that we developed, which I would love to continue this work in Tennessee. So if anybody's interested in partnering with me on getting this assessment looked at and normed for Tennessee, I would be glad to work with you all. But this is what, and this is a link so you all can actually have access to this. This is a very quick scan where you can actually ask the person, and I think we wanted to make sure this was in kind of a 10 question or less kind of resource for social service providers. You can give this to the hairdresser, you can give this to the bus driver, use this link. And it just kind of, it's like, as you're talking to the person, what are you seeing? And so you can use this, and as you answer the questions, and I will kind of put in a few answers here so that you all can kind of see what we've developed. Like I said, this was developed primarily for the state of Alabama, but I would love to partner with any of the agencies in Tennessee to get this for Tennessee. But if you see what happens as I'm answering the questions, and anybody, you do not need a social services degree to answer these questions, which I think is really, really important. And there's don't know, and then you hit submit, and it gives you an actual idea of what's going on. Based on this is a serious crime, call the police. So it will give you, we never say no risk, like, because we don't know, but it's low, medium, and high, and we have resources. What I would love to do, and I will stop sharing, is to be able to have, yes, resources slide, absolutely. I would love to be able to have an opportunity to have this for Tennessee. So I need agency partners to do that. So there is my one plug for my research. To be able to have that, I think would be really helpful. I have not, but I will, Denise. Thank you. Okay. And so this is live on a website. Even before we have all of our good Tennessee resources, you all can use that link and share that widely as people are talking to other people. As you don't have to be a trained social services provider to use that link. So I love the idea of I will contact DOH to see if they would like to partner with me to get this set up for Tennessee. So I think, has everyone gotten all the information off the resources slide? I know you all wanted to see that a little longer.
I'm going to send out a copy as well, Javonda. I can send it via email just so everybody has it too.
And those are some references, so you all will have that. And I know we are pretty much close to our time, but I do want to leave it for any additional questions, comments about the material that we covered.